On behalf of our sponsors, Interpreter Foundation, Scripture Central, Brigham Young University, and FAIR, we are happy to introduce to you Professor Gary Rendsburg from Rutgers University. I'm happy to welcome him back to BYU and to Provo. In preparing this introduction, I have drawn on primarily his vita, which you can find, and I encourage you to do so, on the Rutgers University website. His vita is only 51 pages long. He is an illustrious, generous, and wonderful scholar, focusing much on Abraham and his career. Gary received his bachelor's degree at the University of North Carolina in Chapel Hill, which happens to be just down the street from where I graduated that same year from Duke University, the law school there. He then got his PhD at NYU in 1980, and that was the year I joined BYU law faculty and brought farms to Provo. So we've got some connections here, Gary. He worked closely with his mentor, Cyrus Gordon, who wrote books such as The Bible and the Ancient Near East, Homer and Bible, key sources that we as Latter-day Saint scholars have also enjoyed using. I can attest that it was academic heresy in those days to try to connect the worlds of classical Greek and biblical Hebrew, the East and the West. Those were poles apart, worlds very different. And the bridge seemed to be found initially through the Ugaritic epics, as Gary and Cyrus Gordon and others had realized. Currently, he holds the endowed chair of Jewish history at Rutgers University in New Jersey. Previously, he has taught at Cornell University and Canisius College in upstate New York and western New York, Joseph Smith's neighborhoods. He has taught courses, yes, count them, 30 of them, on topics such as the Bible, the Dead Sea Scrolls, Hebrew, Ugaritic, Aramaic, hieroglyphic Egyptian, the Bible and literature, the Bible and culture, the Bible and people. He also has generously shared his talents in administrative work, serving as chair, director, editor, and co-editor, and member of many academic societies and publications. His list of guest speeches numbers over 60, speaking at places like Oxford, Cambridge, Bar-Ilan University, Catholic University, Harvard, Stanford, and BYU, all over the world. He's also been involved a great deal in digital humanities and also dirt work out in archaeology, working with Hebrew manuscripts and taking tours. So he's a very diverse person. He has authored 8 books and co-edited 10 and published 220, if I count correctly, articles and reviews. You can also look at Wikipedia under Gary Rendsburg. He was born in 1954, so he is a young 70 these days. Gary is clearly interdisciplinary. We like that. He challenges the documentary hypothesis. We don't mind that either. While he accepts the clear distinctions between the priestly and Deuteronomic materials in the Torah, he has solidly argued that the prose stories in the Torah come from a single voice. He's a master of understanding various Hebrew dialects and has written widely on a host of ancient literary and stylistic devices, including alliteration, style switching, repetition with variation, the intentional use of syntax, and also chiasmus. All of these topics and many more are included in his book, How the Bible is Written. Gary was here at BYU in 2017 for our celebration of the 50th year of the discovery of chiasmus in the Book of Mormon. Gary's masterful contribution to that two-day symposium, entitled Chiasmus in the Book of Genesis, leads the list of scholarly articles in the book that came out of that conference called Chiasmus, the State of the Art. And what Gary focused on there will provide a basis for what he will say today, where he saw there for the first time the three main themes expressed in the book of Genesis, namely, 1, the Abraham cycle, with its focal point in Genesis chapter 17 on the Abrahamic covenant; 2, the Jacob cycle, with its focal point in Genesis chapter 30, centering on the decision to return to the land of Israel, Canaan; and 3rd, the Joseph cycle, the focal point of that being chapter 45, spotlighting the family reunion of Joseph and his brothers. And so we have there the three themes: covenant, land, and family. These create for Gary the essential foundation of the message of the Bible. Quote, God and the people of Jacob are forever inextricably linked by way of covenant, a covenant that is grounded in God's earlier covenant with Abraham, and even before that with Adam and Eve, and thus with the whole human family. Gary is a wise man, a kind man. I like to see him as becoming like Abraham, bridging east and west, connecting God and people, mind and spirit, finding unities in differences, and wanting to bless the whole world. I also see Gary not only in the Hebrew mode, but like Solon of Athens, who was a wise ruler who mitigated social injustice by moderate compromise, and who improved the law code in the city charter of Athens while celebrating the humanities, even writing a poem on the 10 ages of man. Reminiscence, perhaps, Gary, of the 10 labors of Hercules and the 10 trials of Abraham. Gary spoke last Saturday in day one of this conference, arguing for a northern Mesopotamian origin of Abraham. His paper today is entitled Echoes of the Temple in Jerusalem in the Abraham Story, which we eagerly welcome, and with great interest and appreciation, I give you Professor Gary A. Rendsburg.
Good morning, everyone. It is always a pleasure to be at Brigham Young. This is the third time I'm on the campus, and I just want to thank everybody involved with organizing the conference at Scripture Central and the Interpreters Foundation and Brigham Young community more generally. And just thanks to my dear colleagues of long standing with whom I was able to spend some pleasurable hours yesterday, Paul Hoskison, who's in the room here with us, and Jack Welch, whose lovely introduction was so generous and so lovely. So thank you, Jack, for that. And with that, let's begin, and good morning to all, both those in the room and those who are connecting remotely. Echoes of the Temple and Jerusalem in the Abraham story. Where are you going to find Jerusalem in the Abraham story? Jerusalem's not mentioned in Genesis, it's not mentioned in the entire Torah. Where are you going to find the temple? Obviously, it's not there in Genesis. We'll find a tabernacle when we get to the book of Exodus, but what's with the temple? But let's find elements of both of these items in the Abraham story. But I want to begin by taking us on an excursion to late 16th century Tudor Elizabethan England. And I want you to imagine a scene in London in 1593. All of the people whom you see here in this text box, Shakespeare and colleagues were all alive at the same time. And I would say that they informed one another. They played off each other. We certainly know that for sure for Shakespeare and Marlowe. But all of these individuals, the three playwrights, Shakespeare, Marlowe, Johnson, the poets, Donne and Spenser, and the essayists, Francis Bacon and Walter Raleigh, you can just see so many similar scenes between and among all of them. Now, what led to that moment in time in 1593, when, to my mind, those seven individuals created, and there were others, those seven individuals created what I would call modern English literature. In the previous century, the following had occurred. William Caxton brought the first printing press to England in the late 15th century. In the wake of Gutenberg, he had learned the new art of printing, and he brings the printing press to England. A generation later, all these things are well known. Henry VIII breaks with Rome, and he establishes the Church of England in 1534, thereby embracing the Protestant Reformation. Canterbury Cathedral, that remarkable institution, obviously Catholic up until that point, is converted to the mother church of the Church of England, and of course it remains that way to the present day, with the Archbishop of Canterbury heading the church. A few years later, Henry VIII goes one step further, and he dissolves all the monasteries, all those older Catholic institutions, priories, abbeys, monasteries, and so on, so that when you travel in England today, you can visit them and they're all in ruins. And this is what my wife and I spend our summers doing, visiting ruined abbeys from Glastonbury in the southwest to Lindisfarne in the northeast. When Henry VIII died, he was succeeded by three of his children, who are portrayed here not in chronological order: Edward first, then Queen Mary, and then Queen Elizabeth. Edward the Protestant, Mary the Catholic, Elizabeth restoring the Protestant Reformation. And ever since then, of course, England has remained a solidly and officially Anglican country. So all of these things are happening in the lead up to Shakespeare and his contemporaries. Where am I going, by the way? Yes, we'll get to the book of Genesis, don't worry. And under Queen Elizabeth, England reaches the height of its power. Francis Drake circumnavigates the world during the 3 years of the late 1570s, but he's back in England just in time to defeat the Spanish Armada in 1588, which of course changes all European history. Imagine if Spain had won, what consequences there would have been, with most likely England becoming a Catholic country again, and the likes of the England that we know would not have transpired. Around the same time, James Burbage builds the first theater in London. Up until this time, plays were not seen as anything serious. Theater was on the social margins of the society. But James Burbage builds the theater, and eventually, of course, the Globe would be constructed as well. His son, Richard Burbage, was one of the main actors in Shakespeare's company. So all of that is happening, and it leads to a moment in time when these seven individuals, and there are others, create, to repeat what I said at the outset, what we know today as English literature. And of course, we still read these and still watch the plays produced especially by Shakespeare, but also by Marlowe and Johnson. So with that as an introduction, and as a model, and as an analogy for something that we know for sure in real history of about 500 years ago, I want to take you now to ancient Israel, where, of course, we have less documentary evidence, and so we have to reconstruct to the best as we can what transpired in ancient Israel to bring about the beginnings of the Bible, and in particular, the focus of my talk this morning, the book of Genesis. So here is a map of the 12 tribes. We don't put tribal boundary lines. Some maps do. I prefer not to, because although we can trace them more or less from the book of Joshua city lists, better to just give an approximation of where they were located. And of course, up until this point, Jerusalem was not even an Israelite city. Jerusalem had remained an independent city-state, called in the Bible also by the name Yevus, and therefore we get the Jebusites, so is the population of Jerusalem, surrounded totally by Israelite tribes, especially Judah to the south and Benjamin to the north, but not part of the nation of Israel. If you can imagine one of the microstates of Europe today, right, like an Andorra or a San Marino, right? Or a Liechtenstein, if that helps, right? Not an independent country, not related politically to the countries nearby. David, of course, captures Jerusalem and makes it the capital city and embarks on a new program, which is to create the united monarchy. Now, Saul, of course, had preceded him with the title of king, but Saul's kingship is a transitionary one. He doesn't have a palace. He has the title of king, but he doesn't have a palace. He doesn't have a capital. He continues to live in his ancestral home in the city of Gibeah. It is David and his son Solomon who will create the real monarchy of ancient Israel. And they are the ones who unite the 12 tribes more so than Saul had done. This is a reconstruction of 10th century Jerusalem. You see there on the bottom right, so a shout out to Lane Rittmeyer, a Dutch architect archaeologist now living in Wales, who is a leader in creating these kinds of images to give us a good sense of what Jerusalem and other places looked like in ancient times. So Jerusalem is a relatively small hillside surrounded by valleys on all sides, with the exception of its northern flank, which is that bald mountain area that you see there in the upper right, which is eventually where the temple will be built, what is known today as Temple Mount. So this is the city in which David, from which David ruled once he made it the capital of Israel. Here's an aerial view of Jerusalem today, just to give you a sense. It is actually not the best photograph, but I use it for the following reason. You're going to love this. Let's superimpose ancient Israel on ancient Jerusalem on modern Jerusalem. I don't know who did this work, but somebody remarkably, everybody loving this? Somebody remarkably showed us how Jerusalem would have looked like then. Of course, all the other buildings that you see here, including Temple Mount, dominated by the Dome of the Rock, would not have been there. So it gives you a sense of David's Jerusalem with the valleys surrounding it. Or another image, this time showing you construction to the north with the temple there in the upper right, by the time Solomon has built that in the mid 10th century. Archaeologists have uncovered much of this, including our late departed colleague Eilat Mazar, who excavated what she believes, and I agree, to be David's palace. More neutrally, archaeologists simply call it the large stone structure. These are very large stones compared to the other stones that one finds in Jerusalem, in this area, which, by the way, is known still today as the city of David, Ir David in Hebrew. The archaeological site is open to the public. It's been covered over, as you can see, by these by this wood and metal covering there. But you can walk throughout the site, and everything is well signed. So neutrally, we'll call it the large stone structure. Everybody can agree to that. And most likely, given the size of the building and the size of the stones, we'll agree with Eilat Mazar that indeed this is David's palace. And that you see there smack in the middle of the image, the large building to the upper right of the city of David as it existed prior to its extension northwards under Solomon to build the temple. Here is that another image by Lane Rittmeyer, once again, showing you the temple complex. You can see David's palace, and you see the extension now, doubling the size of the city, basically, when Solomon constructs northward including the temple, and 2 areas of the temple and palace are then connected by some urban housing areas. And an artist's rendering of the temple, just to remind us what Solomon's temple looked like, based on the description, the very detailed description we get in the book of Kings, 1 Kings, chapters 6, 7, and 8. Obviously, this is a site that cannot be excavated because it is under Temple Mount, where you have layers and layers of destructions and various structures. If we could magically excavate the area, just to remind you, today you have the Dome of the Rock dominating Temple Mount, built in the 7th century. Underneath that, we know there was we have evidence for a Christian church, and underneath that, a Roman temple, and underneath that, the second Jewish temple, and underneath that would have been the first Jewish temple. So these are areas that cannot be excavated, but at least we have a good idea of what the structure looked like. So from this relatively small city under David, although it doubles in size under Solomon, these 2 generations of rulers transform the nation of Israel, the kingdom of Israel, in the manner that we've been discussing. Here's an aerial view of Jerusalem today, a slightly better one. And if you want to know where the BYU Center is, it's up there on the upper right, sort of, on Mount Scopus. Not enough detail to actually see it, but amongst the buildings that you see there. Okay. So it's not only the kingdom of Israel that they're ruling over, but according to the book of Samuel, 2 Samuel, and into 1 Kings, David and Solomon rule over a very large empire. You see Israel, or Israel and Judah, together on the map on the left or on the right as well. All the little kingdoms around the edges are incorporated into the empire: Edom, Moab, Ammon, and a large swath of land, which we generically call Aram in the northeast, which is a series of kingdoms. Aram, Damascus, and a few others are labeled here, all the way up to the Euphrates River. Now, that entire kingdom under David being ruled from this tiny little city right here. So these are the new developments in the 10th century BCE. Monarchy, that's something new in Israel. According to traditional Israelite belief, as embodied in the biblical text, only God is king. A human king is a compromise on a major theological tenet of ancient Israel. Other peoples can have kings, large entities like Egypt with the Pharaoh, Assyria, Babylonia, the Hittites, etc. But even small entities, every city-state in the land of Canaan, including Jerusalem prior to the time of David, had a king. Jerusalem is the capital. This is something new. The Israelites are familiar with other capitals, including Shechem, if you can even speak of a capital, at least say a religious center. The tabernacle is all Israel's ever had. And now all of a sudden you have this idea of temple, which David had planned, but it was eventuated by his son Solomon. That's strikingly new. And of course, the whole idea of this empire. All of this happened so quickly. It's a little bit like what happened in Tudor England. That's why I took you back to 16th century England. So many radical changes in that country, which leads to the creation of the literature that I was describing. So many crucial changes in Israel at this time. And I think that this is where you will find the beginnings of biblical writing. There were certainly more archaic materials, many of which, or some of which, have been embedded into the biblical text, including archaic poems like Exodus chapter 15, Judges chapter 5. But prose writing comes of age in the 10th century, and starting with the book of Genesis, recording the older traditions taking us back to Abraham. And here are just a couple of fragments of some of our oldest Torah scrolls found in the Cairo Geniza. These are both located today at the Cambridge University Library. Okay, and we're not advancing. There we go, good. So with that, let us now begin to look specifically at key passages in the book of Genesis, chapter 17. God says to Abraham, I will make you exceedingly fruitful, and I will make nations of you, and kings shall come forth from you. And then later in the chapter, when God's still speaking to Abraham, but now speaking about Sarah, he says, and I will bless her, etc. Kings of people shall come forth from her. Now, what is the point of God promising to Abraham that he and Sarah will be the progenitors of a royal line? I would submit that this would have been laughed at or questioned anytime prior to the establishment of the monarchy, because every person in ancient Israel would have said, no, God is king. In fact, the prophet Samuel gives voice to that in 1 Samuel chapter 8, when the people clamor for a king, which brings about the first king's, the anointing of Saul. These passages, I submit, are embedded into a narrative written in the 10th century when kingship is new, when monarchy is being developed in the country, and it shows you the divine approval of having a human king descended from Abraham. That's what these passages are doing. These cannot be dated earlier because it would make no sense to an Israelite. In fact, it would run counter, as I've just said, to biblical theology. And it doesn't make sense to date these at any time later on, after which kingship is a fait accompli and no one's questioning the issue anymore, as we see from the later book of Kings, whether they're kings of Judah or Israel. In Genesis 15, when God makes the covenant with Abraham, still called Abram at that point, he says, to your descendants I give this land from the river of Egypt to the great river, the river Euphrates. Again, this would be unthinkable and would have no place in biblical thought during the time of the judges or even during the time of King Saul, when Israel knew that it was a small nation. You have all sorts of passages which talk about Israel as a small nation. And it wouldn't make any sense later because Israel never ruled this territory that you see here. It's only under David and Solomon that this is part of the Israelite polity. And so God anticipates this in his words to Abram. And again, here are the boundaries from the brook of Egypt, which is not the Nile. Here it's translated the river of Egypt. It's not the Nile, but it's rather the Wadi El Arish, which is indicated on the lower left there, the brook of Egypt, all the way up to the Euphrates River. These are the boundaries of David and Solomon's empire. Which of the tribes is going to be the royal tribe? Well, the Benjaminite attempt with Saul doesn't last very long, and that's the end of that dynasty. His son Ishbosheth rules for 2 years afterwards, but that's it. The royal tribe is obviously going to be Judah, and Judah is therefore selected in Jacob's blessings to his 12 sons in Genesis 49. The scepter shall not depart from Judah, nor the ruler's staff from between his feet, until tribute come to him, and to him is the homage of peoples. So there is no use of the word king here, but look at all the poetic metaphors for kingship, including scepter and tribute and homage and so on. In Genesis 38, actually, let's go back one moment here, because you also see the prominence of Judah elsewhere in the Joseph story. He is the most prominent of the sons, especially his very long speech at the end of chapter 44, which is put in his mouth, not any of the other brothers. And it is the speech that brings Joseph to tears at the beginning of chapter 45, where he discloses his identity to his brothers and is reunited with them. But there's also the story in Genesis 38 and all of the echoes of that story that we see in the life of David. Judah has a wife who is not given a name, but her description is Bat-shua, the daughter of Shua. This evokes David's wife, Bathsheba, although strikingly, I don't have it here on the text box, but in the book of Chronicles, Bathsheba is actually known as Bat-shua, exactly what you see in Genesis 38 for the wife of Judah. And Judah has a daughter-in-law named Tamar. David actually has a daughter named Tamar. You can't change the tradition. You can't just say, oh, I'm going to make Tamar out to be the daughter of Judah. No, you can't do that. You have to stay with the tradition which was received, that she was the daughter-in-law. But the stories can echo one another in the manner with the words and the names of the characters that you see here. All of this, accordingly, is being written in this little, still relatively small city of Jerusalem. It would eventually expand to the Western Hill, which you see here in the upper left. Jerusalem, of course, by the time of the later kings of Judah, would become a major center, and it would become a major center yet again during the Herodian and Roman periods. So let's go back to Shakespeare and show you what he is doing as a parallel to this. One of his plays, of course, is Richard II, about a king who lived 200 years prior, at the end of the 14th century. And Queen Elizabeth, who was a devotee of the theater, if the movie Shakespeare in Love helps you visualize all this, I think that's a great way of doing it. She actually turned, we have this famous quote of hers, she actually turned to her, to one of her lords, William Lambard, and famously said, "I am Richard II, know ye not that?" In other words, Queen Elizabeth knew enough about what Shakespeare was doing that she saw the monarchy of her day, with her as the regent, being exposed, as it were, in the play Richard II. Now, we have a problem here because Richard II is seen as less than positive, and Queen Elizabeth is always seen as very positive, and Shakespeare was very devoted to her. But nevertheless, he is evoking the past as he writes in the present. Now, what happens when James VI of Scotland becomes James I of England? Do you all remember your British history? When Queen Elizabeth dies in 1603, she dies unmarried, without a child, and there are no more descendants of Henry VIII. So this is the end of the Tudor line. Who is going to become the King of England? And Queen Elizabeth had expressed the wish that her cousin, King James of Scotland, ruling in Edinburgh, should become the King of England. And so James VI of Scotland moves from Edinburgh to London, where he becomes James I. What does Shakespeare do? Shakespeare immediately writes King Lear and Macbeth. King Lear, about a legendary British king who ruled all of Great Britain, England, Scotland, and Wales, just like James is now doing. And then a year later, he writes Macbeth, about a historical king of Scotland, because now you have a Scottish king on the throne in London. Do they teach you this when you read Shakespeare in high school? I don't think we always get this point. Moreover, his reflection of James in the play Macbeth is highlighted by the scene of the witches, which is so famous at the beginning of the play Macbeth, because James had written a book 6 years earlier called Demonology, printed first in Scotland and then in London in 1603. And he talks all about the occult and witches and all those things that the Bible prohibits, especially in the book of Deuteronomy. James was obsessed, I would say that in a good way, with the whole topic. And so when Shakespeare writes Macbeth, about a historical Scottish king, the famous opening scene of the witches, which is then portrayed in this beautiful painting by James Henry Nixon, now in the British Museum. So think about all these things when you're thinking about Shakespeare's plays, both the histories and the tragedies. More recently, in our own time, Arthur Miller writes The Crucible in the 1950s. It's set in Salem, Massachusetts at the end of the 17th century, but everybody who sees the play in the 1950s knows that it is, in fact, an echo of the present day McCarthyism, which was so prominent here in America, and of which Miller himself had been a victim. So you write about the past, Macbeth, Salem witch trials, Richard II, whatever it is, but you're reflecting the present, and everybody knows it. So the book of Genesis is written in the 10th century. It is about the past. It is about Abraham, let's say 4 centuries earlier. but it is about the present at the same time. It is the brilliance of this text that it is able to go seamlessly, channeling the traditions that had been received about Abraham and also Isaac, Jacob, etc., and not changing the story, but reflecting the present as the story is composed. Here's an example as we now move specifically to issues of temple and Jerusalem. Abraham builds multiple altars as you read through the book of Genesis, including in chapter 12. He builds an altar at Shechem and another altar between Bethel and Ai. But somewhat puzzlingly, he never sacrifices at these places. He just builds the altar there. Well, this is probably because there was a tradition of an altar at Shechem. Yes, there was. There was an altar near Bethel, or maybe even in Bethel, hence the name of the city, meaning house of God. So yes, these would have been well-known altar sites. But the only place that Abraham actually sacrifices is in Genesis 22, the culmination of the Abraham cycle. In the introduction, thank you, Jack Welch, for bringing attention to my article on the chiasmus in the biblical story of Abraham, which culminates there in Genesis 22. And the only place he sacrifices is obviously not Isaac, but the ram caught in the thicket, which he sacrifices on the altar at Moriah. So here is here's a key passage from Genesis chapter 22. And I'm going to read this one aloud in Hebrew. I've also given you the transcription. It's always good to hear a little Hebrew, yes, at a biblical conference. Vayikra Avraham Shem HaMakom Hahu Adonai Yir'eh, and now I'm going to speak very slowly so you hear all the sounds. Adonai Yir'eh, actually let me say Yahweh. Yahweh Yir'eh, Asher Ye'amer Hayom Bahar Yahweh Yir'eh. If you heard me say all that, you hear all the sounds of the word Yerushalayim, Jerusalem. In other words, the actual sounds as you read this. And I envision somebody in ancient Israel presenting this text. Remember, there is no silent reading in antiquity. One person held a copy of the text and read it aloud as a presenter or even a performer to a gathering of people like we have in this room. I can imagine shepherds at the end of the day, after the sheep have been restored to their, have been laid down, and they're in a pastoral setting or perhaps in an urban setting near the city gates, where people would read these texts, and this is how you learned your traditions and your stories and your theology and so on. So the sounds of Yerushalayim are right there in the text that you see before you. This is the way that the biblical text of Genesis 22 is telling you the only place you can sacrifice, the only place you should sacrifice is Jerusalem, the new center that David and Solomon have created. Now, in Genesis 22, it's called only Moriah, but already by 2 Chronicles chapter 3, written in the Persian period, you do have the tradition that, in fact, Mount Moriah is Jerusalem. This is the first time that tradition is recorded, but I suspect that the tradition goes back much older than the Chronicles text written in the Persian period. And so here you have the idea that Solomon began to build the house of the Lord in Jerusalem on Mount Moriah. Now, Genesis 14. I said that there is no mention of Jerusalem in Genesis. That's technically true. But we do have reference to it by the shorter name of Salem. And that's what you see here in Genesis 14. So a famous passage. And Melchizedek, king of Salem, brought out bread and wine, and he was a priest to God Most High. Notice that he is both a king and a priest. We'll come back to that in just a moment. He's called in the Hebrew text here, Melech, king, and Kohen, priest. So Melchizedek, the king of Salem, it's still this independent city-state. Obviously, it was that in Abraham's day and clearly down to the time of David, as I mentioned, brings out bread and wine. These are the two essentials, obviously, in the ancient Near Eastern tradition generally, but certainly known best of all from the Israelite/Jewish tradition, and of course has reverberations in Christianity as well. And then Abraham tithes to Melchizedek. Vayitain lo maaser mikol, and he gave him, he meaning Abraham, gave to him, meaning Melchizedek, a tenth of everything. Why does the book of Genesis have this embedded here in Genesis 14? It is the Genesis author's way of saying to you, here's this man of 400 years ago who is the king of Salem. It is okay now to worship God, God Most High, El Elyon. It is okay to worship God Most High in Jerusalem. I know, it's as if the text of Genesis, the composition is saying, I know, we know, you've been going to Shiloh, you've been going to Shechem, you've been going to other places. It's now time for a change. It is now Jerusalem where you are going to worship the one God in the one city, in the one temple. And so this is how you create new beliefs and practices, right? There are no theological treatises, right? There are no philosophical treatises. You teach through story, and that's what the Torah does. The name Melchizedek actually can be divided up into the word for king and the word for righteous. Now, the first high priest in the Solomonic temple, in other words, who's high priest when Solomon builds the temple, is a man named Tzadok, English Zadok. And they both come from the same Hebrew root, which is the word for righteous. So here's Jerusalem. Tzadok is actually already a priest in David's time, and he lives beyond David's time and becomes the priest under Solomon when the temple is built. If we go to, let me go back to the Jerusalem map, somewhat there in the center, butting off of the city walls, coming off the city walls perpendicular to it, you see a fortress that is guarding the Gihon Spring. The Gihon Spring is the major water source of Jerusalem. Now let's go back to Eden. The four rivers of Eden, the Tigris and Euphrates, we have no problem locating them on the map. We know where they are in Mesopotamia. The Pishon remains a question. It may refer to the Nile. We don't know. But the Gihon is there. Now, there is no river Gihon anywhere in the Near East, but it is the name of the spring of Jerusalem. It is the great water source of Jerusalem then. And if I say to you it's still there, that's because nothing has changed in 3,000 years, and you can go visit it, and you can go wade in it even. And the word Gihon actually means gusher. It is such a powerful spring, and you can still hear the gushing of the Gihon if you're in the vicinity on regular or irregular random times when the spring gushes. So the author of the creation account places Gihon as one of the four rivers of Eden. It is another embedding of Jerusalem into the Genesis narrative, not specifically the Abraham portion of Genesis, but prior to that in Genesis chapter 3. And all of this, I keep going back to this image, which I love, just to remind us of what Jerusalem was like when all of this is being proposed and composed to give us the book of Genesis. Remember those boundaries, right? Well, we saw the passage in Genesis 15, but it also allows the biblical text to show the interrelationship between these countries, right? Aram is mentioned in Genesis 22 as the grandson, so he would be the progenitor of the Aramean people. Aram is mentioned as the grandson of Abraham's brother Nahor. So related, but not all that close. Moab and Ammon are developed as the sons of Lot, slightly closer to Abraham. Jacob and Esau are twins because the Israelites saw a kinship between themselves and the Edomites to the south. They were the people to whom they were most closely related because of the desert experience and Edom remaining down there in the desert region to the far south of Israel. This is where Israelite origins are to be found in what I call the Great Southland, the Sinai, Negev, southern Jordanian desert. And then also embedded, although we now have to move forward to the Jacob story, we have this passage where Isaac anticipates that Esau will break the yoke of Jacob, right? Which is to say that Edom will rebel against Israel, which is exactly what happens in 1 Kings. So these texts are speaking to one another. The United Monarchy texts speak to Genesis. The Genesis texts speak to the United Monarchy. The younger son motif. Throughout the book of Genesis, it is the younger son who leapfrogs over the older brother. Isaac over Ishmael, Jacob over Esau, Joseph over his brothers, and in the next generation, Peretz over Zerach and Ephraim over Manasseh. And you actually have a foreshadowing of this with Abel over Cain, and an echo of it in the book of Exodus with Moses over Aaron. The one to the left in all of these is the younger son. So that is part of an ancient Near Eastern epic tradition. We find it already in Ugaritic epic and elsewhere, but the Bible takes this story and makes it very, very prominent, or takes this motif and emphasizes it over and over again. Why? Well, famously, David is the youngest son of Jesse, and Solomon is probably the youngest son of David. He's certainly younger than Adonijah and the other brothers. And so in this palace, if you can join me in being transported back 3,000 years, in this palace, you have all the palace intrigue of who will succeed David. And it is the younger or youngest son who does, just like David, it was the youngest son of Jesse. Therefore, you embed into the Abraham story, Isaac, not Ishmael, will be the bearer of the covenant, and all the other younger son motifs. More negatively, fraternal strife, of course, is to be found in the Genesis stories, not really between Isaac and Ishmael, although there may be one little thing there in Genesis 21, but certainly between Jacob and Esau and Joseph and his brothers. And this is an echo of what happens in the stories of the book of Samuel and the early chapters of Kings, where you have two instances of fratricide. In fact, the word basadeh, meaning in the field, is an echo, a lexical echo, between the first fratricide, between the first two brothers, Cain killing Abel, and the story, and a somewhat parable-like story told by the wise woman of Tekoa, who describes how one of her sons killed the other, basadeh, in the field. Let's go back to Melchizedek. And we looked at this before. Now, in 2 Samuel 24, the very last chapter of the book, David buys the threshing floor from Araunah the Jebusite, which in turn becomes the spot where the temple will be built, right there on Temple Mount. But who is this person, Araunah? He appears only here. I mean, there's stories retold in the book of Chronicles, but he appears only here, nowhere else, in all of the long story of the life of King David, bridging all of the second half of 1 Samuel, all of 2 Samuel, and the first two chapters of Kings. Here's the text. Araunah said, "Why has my lord the king come to his servant?" And David said, "To buy from you the threshing floor to build an altar to Yahweh." And Araunah said to David, "May my lord the king take it and offer up whatever is good in his eyes." And then it says this in verse 23. Araunah the king gave everything to the king. I'm going to read that in Hebrew. Hakol natan Araunah hamelech lamelech. And Araunah said to the king, "May the Lord your God favor you." Now, Araunah is not a personal name. We now know that it's actually a title, and it's in the ancient non-Semitic language of Hurrian, in which the word Iri or Irui means lord or king, and unlike other languages, the definite article is placed on the end, and the definite article is ne. So Irwine means the Lord or the King in Korean. And we know that there was a Horian presence in Jebusite Jerusalem. So this Araunah is actually the word for the Lord or the King in the Korean language. Now, if you can read the Hebrew there, the third and fourth words say Araunah Hamelech, Araunah the King. Almost all biblical scholars do not accept the Masoretic text here because they cannot accede to the idea that Araunah was the king. They do everything possible to amend the text, even though the text is 100% clear. We should accept the text, we should receive it and accept it seriously and treat it seriously. And I have translated it as the Hebrew reads. So Araunah was the king of Jerusalem prior to David becoming the king of Jerusalem. To my mind, Zadok, the first high priest, is Araunah, the king. And it is an echo of Melchizedek back in Genesis chapter 14. Araunah was his title, Zadok or Zadok was his personal name. And so when David became king, he allowed the prior priest king, remember Melchizedek in Genesis 14 is both Kohen and Melech. He's both priest and king. That was the Canaanite system, and elsewhere in the Near East as well, where the king served as high priest. Obviously in Israel, that was separated out. The king from the tribe of Judah, the high priest from the tribe of Levi. So you couldn't have the overlap, the overlay. But in the Canaanite system, you did, and we have all manner of examples of that from our documentation. Including this figure of Melchizedek, a king of a Canaanite city-state. In the stories of King David, you have three generations of priests who are mentioned, going back into 1 Samuel. Ahimelech, Abiatar, and then another Ahimelech, the grandson of the first one. Zadok does not appear. All of a sudden, he appears in 2 Samuel 15. Where did he come from? Right? It's after David captures Jerusalem and makes it his capital city. This person just sort of magically appears in the text. I would say that he is the last king of the city who was allowed to retain his sacerdotal role as priest, but he was stripped of his royal authority, obviously, as David will now become the king of the city. And all of that is the historical background to what you get in Genesis chapter 14. This is where David brings the altar, where he decides that he wishes to build place the altar, and by extension, the tabernacle, but of course, with the ark, and then this would become the site of Solomon's temple. Genesis chapter 3, let's go back to that account. And he, God, placed east of Eden the cherubim. Now, however we understand the cherubim, this implies that Eden is a sacred space. Because the cherubim, as you know, occurs in the Bible as an architectural element with both the tabernacle and then the temple, surrounding the ark, the holiest piece of holiest item within the tabernacle and then the temple. It shows that the Garden of Eden is an imagined sacred space. That's why you need cherubim there. Well, since the Gihon is in the Garden of Eden, and the Garden of Eden has cherubim, right? All of this is going to be portrayed in the connection between Eden and the Gihon and the temple and the cherubim. All of this is happening there in the biblical account. And Melchizedek in Genesis 14 with Abraham, and Abraham performing a sacrifice of a ram only at Moriah, which is the Temple Mount. It all fits together. I just want to call attention to a couple of my publications, if you'd like to read some of this, although not in the great detail that I presented here today. My chapter on the ancestral narratives in the Ancient Israel, 4th edition volume, and a chapter in my book, How the Bible is Written, my most recent book, entitled When Was All This Written, where I lay all this out. I want to, this great quote. Faulkner said it so well, right? The past is never dead. It's not even past, right? In other words, you'll see another quote in just a moment from Hawthorne. In other words, we live today, but the past is always with us. The text of Genesis is being composed, compiled, authored, redacted, whatever term you want to use, in the 10th century. It is bringing the past to the present. I started with my little imagined London 1593. I want to end with something we know a lot more about and bring it into the American scene, and that is Concord, Massachusetts, from the 1830s through the 1860s. This is the beginning of America in Concord in the mid-19th century. These 6 individuals that you see here on the left, Emerson, Thoreau, Hawthorne, Channing, and father and daughter Alcott, were all living in the little village of Concord, Massachusetts. And if you've never been to Concord, it is a pilgrimage site for us as Americans. Living nearby, all of these individuals had connections to the Concord Circle: Margaret Fuller, Elizabeth Peabody, and Henry Wadsworth Longfellow. Living further away, Herman Melville, including in New York mainly, Herman Melville, Walt Whitman, Horace Greeley, Horace Mann, and they're all in contact with one another. Melville met Hawthorne. Melville dedicated Moby Dick to Hawthorne. Thoreau visited Walt Whitman. Horace Greeley hired Margaret Fuller, and Horace Mann was married to Elizabeth Peabody's sister. They were all interconnected in the 1830s through the 1860s. The first stanza of Emerson's poem, Concord Hymn, is inscribed on the base of the Minuteman statue in Concord by Daniel Chester French, sidebar comment, who also designed the Lincoln Memorial statue of Lincoln. And it is in eye distance, you can see it. This statue is just to the side of the old manse where Emerson's grandfather had lived and had witnessed the Battle of Concord. So when Emerson writes 2 generations later, Concord Hymn, I mean, for him, this is personal. It's like our people in Genesis, our writers of Genesis, it's personal. Abraham, they know Abraham, even though they're at a distance of centuries. Here we are, Emerson writing this poem. Well, his grandfather lived it, right? And Emerson was now living in the house, and eventually Hawthorne would live there as well. Hawthorne's 2 great novels are set in colonial America. He's writing in the 1850s, but he knows that colonial America is disappearing, and we have to record and tell those stories. This is Hawthorne's home in Concord, the House of Seven Gables. And he writes about the book that he named after the house. It wasn't his house, it was his relative's house. The point of view in which this tale comes under the romantic definition lies in the attempt to connect a bygone time with the very present that is flitting away from us. That's what the author of Genesis is doing. He is writing about a bygone time, Abraham and his circle, but it also is the very present of Jerusalem. Hawthorne says it is a legend about his book, The House of Seven Gables, right? Skipping down a little bit, he refers to the legendary mist, which the reader, according to his or her pleasure, may either disregard or allow it to float almost imperceptibly about the characters and events for the sake of a picturesque effect. The exquisite literary character of Genesis is related to David's time, just as the literary work of The House of Seven Gables is related to Hawthorne's own time. And he definitely knew his ancestors. He revered his ancestors, as the quote here says, "Let us thank God for having given us such ancestors, and let each successive generation thank him." This is what the author of Genesis is doing. These are my ancestors. These are real, these people. Hawthorne was, sidebar, somewhat embarrassed by his great-great-grandfather, John Haythorne, the only judge at the Salem witch trials who never recanted for his actions. Hawthorne's famous quote, "Time flies over us." Is this amazing? "But leaves its shadow behind." You're in 10th century Jerusalem. You're reading the Abraham story. The stories of Genesis fly over us, but they leave their shadow behind with us in our very present. Longfellow wrote Paul Revere's Ride all at the same time period. He was the grandson of a Revolutionary War general. These Genesis writers were actually descended from Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. They were doing what Longfellow, what Emerson were doing. Longfellow was also descended from Mayflower folk. These four individuals are buried in the same section of the same cemetery in Concord. This truly is sacred space. Emerson, Thoreau, Hawthorne, and Louisa May Alcott are all buried right here in this little picture that you see. And now imagine a similar burial ground in Jerusalem, where the authors of the book of Genesis and the authors of the David story, whose names remain unknown to us, but their narratives, imagine that little cemetery somewhere in Jerusalem, their narratives remain with us ad hayom hazeh, unto the present day. Thank you very much. Todah.
Have a seat. Well, Gary, thank you very much.
Oh, thank you.
Wow, what a whirlwind, covering centuries in a single bound. A super scholar.
Thank you, Jack.
Yeah, wonderful. And so rich, so many threads to pick up here. You did mention there at the end several of your books that you've previously published. Many of the passages that you were quoting there come from 1st and 2nd Samuel. I'd like you to say a little bit about things people will be seeing soon about 1st and 2nd Samuel.
Well, you're very kind. I have just completed a commentary on the book of 1st Samuel. And I've commenced work on the second volume, which of course will be 2nd Samuel. These commentary volumes, which we write, take years. I've been working on that one for about a decade. I went back and looked at this to find out when I started working on it. It was 2015, and here we are in 2025. Not that I work continuously for 10 years on it. We do teach, we do other projects, and so on. And but the Samuel commentary for 1st Samuel is a very, very large volume to be published by the Jewish Publication Society, and I'm really excited about it. It is going to the typesetter perhaps on Monday. It's really ready now. I've signed off on everything regarding the volume. And it is a mainly literary reading. Of course, I deal with the history and the archaeology and the theology, but I love, as you can determine from my quoting everybody from Shakespeare to Longfellow, I love literature, and I'm always looking at the literary angle of things, and hopefully there will be new things there for everyone to discover. And then hopefully 2nd Samuel won't take until 2035. Hopefully that will come out a little bit earlier.
Well, that sounds wonderful, and I assume that in those commentaries you'll have discussions along this line dealing with Jerusalem and backgrounds.
Yes,
and echoes.
and everything is in there. Of course, in 1st Samuel, there's no Jerusalem yet.
Not yet.
There is a reference to Jerusalem. We actually have it mentioned once or twice, but we won't really get to Jerusalem until the 2nd Samuel, when it becomes so much a part of the story, and all the action will take place in there from 2nd Samuel chapter 5 onwards. So I have all that to look forward to. But I do discuss the interrelationships between the texts in Samuel and the texts in Genesis. That does come out in my commentary.
Well, that's wonderful. We have some questions that have come in. Let's take a look at those. One person wonders if the illustrations that you use from Reitmeyer, will they be in the published version of your paper, this paper that will be coming out?
It's possible. We need to get permission, of course, and if we get permission from Lane Rittmeyer, then it would be a lovely thing to do, to include the image. If the editors of the volume and the publishers can accommodate such images. It's a great idea. Thank you for that suggestion.
So we'll work on that. How can we, or what tools do scholars use to separate the historic Abraham from myth and legend?
Right. So all we have, of course, is the book of Genesis. I would say that there's not a lot of myth and legend in the story. When we get to the Exodus account, we, of course, on which I have written several articles, we of course are dealing with things that are beyond the human norm, if I can just say that. I refer to things like the 10 plagues and the splitting of the sea and so on. But those kinds of miraculous, almost otherworldly actions don't occur in Genesis. Apart from perhaps the 3 visitors to Abraham, everything else is just a human going through his life, and we can all relate to it. In fact, I would say that's part of why Genesis speaks to us to such a great extent. We all have, on May 3rd, last Saturday, we had the Seeley's talking about the trials of Abraham and Sarah. We all go through these trials in our life, they may not be the same ones, but we all have the journey of our own personal lives. I think that's what makes the Genesis narrative so remarkable. And it doesn't have any of that, for lack of a better word, miraculous or otherworldly kind of material, which makes it so relatable to us. And I think it's why it still speaks to us at a distance of 3,000 years. So all I can say is we have no reason to remove or to question or anything of that material. We should just accept the Genesis stories about Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob and their wives and their children for what they are, stories about the human condition. That's why we read them and reread them. And part of the wonder is you can reread them, and as I always like to say, I may have read it 20 times, 30 times, and the 31st time I'll still find something new that I had missed the first 30 times. That's the wonder of reading a great text.
Well, that's the beauty of humanities.
Yes.
And it is ancient, and it's modern, and it's future.
Yep. Agreed.
Question here about works that what you've suggested here, people wonder, how have these ideas fared in the General Academy? We have a question about Brueggemann, his book about David and his theologian. And the question points out that he covers some of these same parallels that you do. How many others are doing this kind of thing, and how's it faring in the Guild?
Right. So in the Guild of Biblical Scholarship, I would say, unfortunately, it's not faring well for the following reason. When Jack and I were students, and then when he introduced me, he talked about the overlap of our graduation dates, the confluence, I should say, of our graduation dates. The dating of biblical texts was more or less secure by most scholars. In the decades from that time till today, more and more scholars are dating biblical texts later and later, to the late monarchic period, to the exilic period, to the Persian period. Of course, they do this simply by proclamation without proof. And the number one most objective criterion that one can use for the dating of any text in the Bible or elsewhere is linguistic evidence. And I have spent my career arguing on linguistic grounds for the early dating of these biblical texts, and that's why I date to the 10th century. Now, in the good old days of the JEDP theory, and Brueggemann, I believe, subscribes to it, the Yahwist was dated to the 10th century. And so in his work, I'd have to go back and read it again, but in his work, David and his Theologian, I think he's talking mainly about the J source, the Yahwist source, which he dated, and most people did date to the 10th century. As I just mentioned today, there's more and more movement to date these sources to the very late monarchic, exilic, or post-exilic periods, with no evidence whatsoever. The other place that I would differ is that I don't divide up, and Jack, you mentioned this when you introduced me, I do not divide up the narratives into J, E, and P components. There is a single narrative voice. You can start in the beginning of Genesis at creation and go all the way through to the death of Moses. And the entire Torah or Pentateuch is a single narrative voice. There are minor hiccups along the way, like how many animals did Noah bring on the ark and so on. What were the names of Esau's wives and so on. But by and large, it's a single sustained narrative. It goes from generation to generation. And I just like to read it holistically as I've done. So many of the passages that I looked at today, including Genesis 14, is not part of the Yahweh source, according to those who would follow that approach. I'm now going to quote my teacher, Cyrus Gordon. He would never say that another scholar was wrong. He divided the world of scholarship. He was too gentlemanly for that. He divided the world of scholarship as follows. There are those scholars who catch on fast and those who need more time. So we've all caught on fast, those who do follow this approach, and many, many others will require more time to read and absorb the work that I have done and the work of others have done towards an early dating and a holistic reading of the biblical text in the book of Genesis.
That's wonderfully said. We have also here a question about a post that you put up about Palestinian hieratic. It said it was partially garbled in some way.
Okay.
The question is, are there any religious texts written in Hebrew using Egyptian script?
Right. So the answer is no. The Egyptian hieratic script was used by scribes in ancient Israel, especially for accounting practices. So commodities, numerals, and so on, they borrowed the hieratic writing. But all of that are simply accounting texts. There are no literary texts or religious texts or anything of that sort. Those are all in Hebrew.
But they do know.
In Hebrew and Hebrew
They
script.
do know the Egyptian script.
They know the Egyptian script, right?
So any speculations on your part why they don't do that?
Well, certainly within the Bible, where numerals are never used. Anytime a number, numeral symbols are never used. Anytime a number, if you read your Bible in English, if it says 3 or 600 or whatever the number is, they write them out.
Write out the word.
They write out the words. The largest number that the Bible presents is in the census in the book of Numbers, chapter 1, and I don't remember the exact number, but it's 603,000 so many people. That's all written out in words, right? In other words, the way we can write out SIX.
You mean they hadn't invented Roman numerals
They
yet?
hadn't invented Roman numerals or any. So, but they had these Egyptian hieratic numerals, but they used them only for the accounting world, and they didn't use them for in bookkeeping and accounting and things like that. And they did not use them in the literary text, so we wouldn't expect to find them apparently. But it's remarkable that we have so many of them, and they've just become with each inscription that's found, we find more of them, especially on ostraca. We now have a pretty good database of these, and I always use the material, as I mentioned last Saturday. Wonderful article that David Calabro of BYU published, bringing it all together. So it's a great it's a great element of how archaeology informs the study of ancient Israel.
Yeah, and of course the Greek texts just use the Greek alphabet for letters. The letters in the alphabet also stand for numbers,
which Hebrew would eventually do in the post-biblical period, but not in the Bible.
So that makes it interesting because some numbers can also be words.
Right. So you get, just a simple
crossover.
Yud Dalet, which would be 14, is also the word for Yod, hand, right? So when you read these texts, but that's only a post-biblical thing. Yeah. There may be an occasional place in the Hebrew Bible where a word has some numerical sense to it. People have suggested a few examples as well. But it's typically a post-biblical phenomenon.
Yeah, that's great. Okay, well, Gary, thank you very, very much. You've given us lots to think about. And I'm going to think more about what is a temple theme. You've mentioned temple themes, usually referring to geographical locations or names or historical events. But when you come from, say, looking at the book of Leviticus, and there you have tithing and other things, those are temple themes. But they're not just historical things, they're also now ritual, theological, should we be looking at temple themes in a more in a wider sense?
Well, I can speak certainly from the Jewish tradition, because of course after the destruction of the temple, the second temple in the year 70, Judaism had to sort of reinvent itself or reconstruct itself because it was so temple-centered. The whole tradition is temple-centered. I mean, the book of Leviticus, and even into the book of Numbers, I mean, such detail about how the rituals are to be performed. But since Judaism has not been performing sacrifices since the year 70, the priesthood is still accorded a few honors, but basically are, as I like to quip, they've been collecting unemployment for more than 1900 years. The Judaism has to reinvent itself, and yet there are echoes of the temple rituals still to be found in Jewish rituals today. Absolutely, we just can't move beyond the core, the foundation. Right?
That's right.
It's always there. I almost want to say, I almost want to quote Hawthorne again, right? I mean, the past is always still present with us, and time is flying and leaving its shadow over us. And so there are various synagogue and home rituals which are echoes of the temple. And I actually, on a personal level, should say that I should keep that more in mind when I do those rituals, perform those rituals, or think about that these are echoes from a system of 2,000 years ago. Yeah.
Yeah, and I'd like to suggest that we also have in the temple other themes that can be picked up. Quote yourself on Genesis. What are the key passages there in the chiastic high points? Covenant, family, marriage, land.
Yeah.
Those are traditions that
Yeah.
relate to the Bible
Yeah.
and the temple as well.
And you can do that in the center, by which we would mean the land of Israel or Jerusalem in particular, and you can do those from a distance as well, as we are living thousands of miles away from that center, and they can have the same meaning if your mind is directed to the center, which is what certainly the Jewish tradition has always done. Yeah.
Wonderful, wonderful. Well, well, join me in thanking Gary, and
Thank you all.
we sure appreciate you
Right.
being here.
Thank you. Thank you, John.